Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be continuing our Thomas Pynchon Secondary Literature Review series, this time looking at David Letzler's 2016 essay, A Phenomenology of the Present, Toward a Digital Understanding of Gravity's Rainbow. And in this essay, Letzler uses some slightly unorthodox methods, that is, using digital analysis technologies, two of which we're going to be discussing here. There are three in the essay, however, in which he's going to use these technologies, which are word frequency and keenness analysis, as well as social network analysis, in order to figure out how this highlights Pynchon's understanding of the present, and particularly a dialectical understanding of the present. Because Pynchon is one of these emblematic authors of the 60s and 70s counterculture in the US. It's sort of the hippie movement in which we're moving away from organized structures of power and institutional methods of organization. We're moving towards a sort of hippie way of living, and that requires focusing on the present, focusing on living in the here and now in small collectives that aren't coercive or anything like that. And Pynchon understands that as part of his phenomenology of the present. But on the other hand, it also has the potential to lead to fragmentation, to an instability of the self and whatnot, which we see embodied in Tyrone Slothrop in Gravity's Rainbow as the end of the novel is approaching, and he's sort of dissimulated, turned into a living crossroads, as it says in Gravity's Rainbow. So Pynchon has both of these in mind, and Letzler uses these digital analysis technologies in order to highlight the primacy of that kind of language. Now, for this first tool, Letzler uses the Ant-Conk word frequency and keenness analysis technique. And what happens is you find some sort of reference corpus. In this case, he uses the Brown University Standard Corpus of Present-Day American English, which is a 1,000,000-word snapshot of written American English as it was used in the 60s in novels, newspapers, scholarship, and more. And you basically compare whatever literary sample you have, in this case Gravity's Rainbow, to this sample corpus in order to determine the word frequency and keenness within Gravity's Rainbow. Now, in addition to this full corpus of the English language, there's also one specifically oriented towards fiction that Letzler also uses. And you can see the breakdown of these two charts here in Table 1. And what's of particular importance here is that there are 16 words which appear on both of the lists. 7 of them are fairly common nouns in Pynchon: rocket, zone, white, shit, light, sky, and wind. There are 3 more that kind of are emblematic of Pynchon's informal prose. You have says, oh, and ha. And then there are 6 more which Letzler finds particularly intriguing, which are here, now, inside, knows, all, and comes. And what's particularly interesting is the here and now. I mean, you can see here is number 2 in the full corpus, and now is 5 in the full corpus. They're a little lower when we enter the fiction corpus, probably because in the full corpus you have things like news broadcasts and whatnot, in which the here and now is sensationalized and whatnot. But still, here is number 6 in the fiction corpus, and now is number 19. And for Letzler, this points out one of the key aspects of Gravity's Rainbow, which is that it's written in the present tense. He says that 8 of the 11 chapters in which those words, namely here and now, are most frequently used are set in the zone. The scene in which Slothrop meets Gelly tripping might suggest why. Gelly explains the zone's ad hoc environment by telling Slothrop it's so unorganized out here. There have to be arrangements. You'll find out. And soon after, Slothrop falls asleep presently in Gelly's bare and open arms. The zone, according to Gelly, is defined by a utopian presentism, one whose reduction of spatiotemporal bounds down to day-to-day living seeks to shut out the great power jostling and long-standing ethnic hatreds that had caused the war in the first place. And this is once again very emblematic of the hippie sort of counterculture movement, in which we're focusing on a utopia that we're building here and now. It's sort of anarchic and opposed to institutional organization, to this great power, which would be things like corporations or various elites, which are going to come in and try to manipulate the present. And one of these key figures that you'll see in Gravity's Rainbow is this notion of delta T, which is just this infinitesimal moment of time between 2 points in time, which is really trying to get at a change in time, because that's what delta means. It means change in time. So this is the most minute change in time. And Letzler points out that the delta T, of course, derives from the Newtonian approximation of an infinitesimally small unit of time, meant to deal with the Eliatic problem of how to describe the rate of change at the present moment. And this is what you do in calculus. If you have a curve and it's a complex curve where you have an equation for it, but the slope is not constant, then if you want to find the rate of change at a particular point, say you have, for example, the parabolic curve of the V2 rocket as it travels up and it starts with its fastest speed and gravity's working on it the whole time such that it slowly points its nose down as gravity makes it slow down and start to come back down. So it eventually reaches an apex where it is parallel with the ground. And then it starts coming right back down. Then it is perpendicular to the ground right as it is about to hit the ground when it has its maximum speed. So at the outer points where it starts and ends, it's fastest, and at the apex, at the top, at the zenith, it's at its slowest point. And if you're trying to figure out the speed of the rocket, for example, at any point on this parabolic curve, you can differentiate at any of these points and find the instantaneous rate of change. And this is using the delta T and things like that. So there's this understanding of, first off, the gravity of the moment itself, of the potential bred into every moment in which, as a member of a field, some object will obtain certain qualities. So, for example, if you have a slinky and you pull it upwards such that part of it is on the ground and the other part is in the air, as a function of its membership in a field, its atoms have certain properties such that it has a lot of built-up potential energy ready to be converted into kinetic energy. So there is literally a potential of the moment which Slothrop is trying to take advantage of in order to understand his conditioning and whatnot. But by the end of the novel, he sort of gives up that forward-thinking aspect of the present that's pushing him into the unknown, and he sort of tries to make the unknown his home. As Letzler says, this moment of reduction to present sensation, with both the place toward which he is headed and that from which he has come obscured, is not liberating for Slothrop, but profoundly destructive. This may be why the novel's later references to delta T invoke not transcendence, but dread. So as we get into Gravity's Rainbow, we see Slothrop's identity become dissimulated, very similar to Oedipus in The Crying of Lot 49, where she initially feels very confidently that after she picks up enough confusing elements in her domain of knowledge, She's like, okay, there's some sort of plot going on or something. And as she's learning about all of, about the Tristero and about the Emirati Anonymous and all of these different groups, she's like, oh, something is going on. But by the end, she's not sure whether she's just inventing this plot, whether this is the result of her psychological machinations and whatnot. And as a result, her project sort of gets dismantled. And for a lot of Pynchon's characters, what drives them is not their motivations per se, but the way in which their project motivates them to act. So there's always this focus in Pynchon upon the actions of the characters, and their intentions and their psychological states will often be somewhat pushed to the side, somewhat inconsequential. This is one of the critiques of Pynchonian characters, is that they're shallow or whatever. And as I've talked about in previous lectures in this series, they're kind of supposed to be shallow. That's the point. Is they're reduced to these molecules in Brownian motions, succumbing to the random qualities of their environment, and oftentimes trying to impose meaning onto that environment or find meaning in that environment. And you'll find, especially in The Crying of Lot 49, there's a lot of emphasis on the notion of the text and having to create a meaning in the text, having to breed meaning into the text, which is a very Derridian sort of idea. But Letzler points out that the novel's language points toward a dialectical conception of the present, not an affirmation of instantaneity. It is no coincidence that here and now frequently appear in the engrams here and there and now and then. And I think that's a really important thing that we can kind of see, for example, in this passage of Pointsman at a Christmas party with the white visitation. He means alone and forever separate. Pointsman knows what he means. So, by surprise, something in him is touched. He feels the Christmas snow now at crevices of his boots, the bitter cold trying to get in. Gwenhydwy, a million ice points falling at a slant across his caped immensity, looking so improbable of extinction that now, from where it's been lying, the same yawing, drunk, chattering fear returns, the curse of the book. And here is someone he wants, truly with all his mean heart, to see preserved. And that really encapsulates part of the counterculture fear, is that the present will not be able to be preserved. That these sort of in-between moments in which we create these tenuous organizations of peace and love and harmony, that they will not be able to be preserved against the powers that be. And this is something that Pynchon is constantly fearing. And there is a slight affirmation, if not a slightly fatalistic or nihilistic affirmation, on the very last page of Gravity's Rainbow, where as the rocket is bearing down upon the Orpheus Theater and it's in its last delta T before contact with the top of the theater, everyone sits basically unaware of the rocket. There is an insinuation that maybe they can see the shadow of the rocket kind of coming in through windows or things like that, but they're probably not aware of it. And of course, this very famous last part. And it is just here, just at this dark and silent frame, that the pointed tip of the rocket, falling nearly a mile per second, absolutely and forever without sound, reaches its last unmeasurable gap above the roof of this old theater, the last delta T. There is time if you need the comfort to touch the person next to you, or to reach between your own cold legs. Or if song must find you, here's one they never taught anyone to sing, a hymn by William Slothrop, centuries forgotten and out of print. And it goes, through this little poem, and then it says, now everybody. And Letzler points out that this is a final depiction of the present moment, which simultaneously invokes community and destruction. And that really is the dialectic of the counterculture. This ethos of communitarian living in the present, and also the very real paranoia of the fleeting nature of this movement, of the fact that you are countering a culture which has been developing for so long and has so many institutions behind it, that it's hard always to see this as, of course, some grand project which will go beyond the moment. That is the real question, is can these characters find some sort of solace to go beyond the moment? Some of them are trying to think about this rationalistic cause and effect, kind of like pointsmen. Some people are trying to think about, maybe I can find some way to think of what's probable amidst this random chaos, such as the case with Roger Mexico. All of these people are trying to find their salve that's going to do the job. But in the end, it seems that probably Pynchon's only real salve, that is our salvation, is love. For the second tool, Letzler uses the AutoMap ORA social network analysis tool. And he explains that, as Franco Moretti notes, social networks are time turned into space. That is, they collate all the complex interactions that happen over time and plot them into an image that can be perceived instantaneously. In other words, the ethos of connectedness espoused both by the narrator and the social network is one where everything exists in a single present. That kind of a present, though, is dialectically opposed to the concept of presentness to that we emphasized in the previous section. Instead of pure contingency, it perceives a never-changing structure that is perpetually enacted. And that's really interesting because this brings to mind these social phenomena such as gender, which Judith Butler is going to talk about as being performative, as being something which is constantly enacted and therefore retroactively justified as something that has always been there. Such that these social networks build up enough connections where they appear to be something transcendent or something absolute. And we see this in the construction of the novel, and Pynchon actually has a really interesting kind of rhetorical technique that he does here, where every time you read a novel, you're thinking about who is the main character, who are the main characters maybe even, but usually you're thinking about a central character who acts as the main character. That's not really the case for Gravity's Rainbow. Initially, you think, it's going to be Pirate Prentice, because for the first, 2 or 3 episodes, Pirate Prentice is the main character, and we get the giant adenoid episode and all of this stuff where Prentice is the focus. But then it switches to Slothrop. So already we're not starting with the main character, and then as we go through, we see Slothrop initially become the central node around which the action of the novel takes place, right? Everyone is trying to get Slothrop. But by the end, what happens? Other characters become more and more important, and Slothrop becomes more and more a mere crossroads. He becomes a dissimulated self in which he is fragmented to the point of this, it reminds me of Zarathustra in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he's dancing naked in the Harz Mountains and singing and dancing and all this stuff. Right? It's just this ecstatic release of libidinal flows and whatnot. But this structure, which is the main character complex, gets perpetually enacted, and Pynchon initially plays on that assumption that Slothrop is the main character, but then gradually that network kind of comes apart and it becomes more and more diffuse. And this relates to entropy, because, for example, entropy is basically a measure of the uniform or ununiform orderliness of a system. So the whole universe is, a collection of particles, and these particles are arranged in nodes, quote unquote. I'm just using that terminology because Letzler will use this terminology of nodes to determine something which is a localized member of a group. It is a discrete member which forms a number of relations and connections with other things and serves as a centralized member. So you could think of, for example, the sun as the node of our galaxy. And it serves as a local point of center. It seems like it's our main character, but that's only a consequence of perspective. If you look out, for example, we're not even in the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And if you zoom even further out, well, there is no center of the universe. So we see that this notion of centeredness, of being the main character, is just a consequence of perspective. And what's going on with entropy is these nodes over time are going to get diffused. Entropy increases, this uniformity of energy gradually increases to the point where energy can no longer coalesce into nodes anymore, and we no longer can form stable relationships between atoms and molecules anymore. We can no longer create stable forms because everything has become so uniform that the disuniformity of atoms cannot be taken advantage of to create stable structures. So we just have this kind of this plastered over uniformity, which leads to the death of the universe, this entropic heat death of the universe. So in the same way, that's what we see going on with Slothrop. He goes from a node, which has tons of kind of liberatory energy bred into him of, oh, he's some sort of almost messianic, he's kind of our lead-in to how we figure out what is actually going on. Everyone wants to get him. He's really important. And by the end, plenty of people forget about Slothrop. They're like, he's not even important. There's a quite famous passage, which I can't remember off the top of my head, which basically says as much, where people have kind of forgotten about him. He's no longer the central character. Now we have lots more interesting kind of secondary love triangles going on that don't even involve Slothrop, in which people, as the war has finished, people are going back to their lives, love triangles are getting broken up, all this stuff, right? So this perpetual enactment can only occur for so long before we have this entropic sort of heat death. And you can really see gravity's rainbow visualized as a social network here in this figure one, this complete character network. And, you can't even make out most of the names of the characters. And he's going to give us some more detailed character networks where we can actually see some of the characters, but you can see that everything kind of has a center here. But as I said, centeredness is a sort of matter of perspective, and so is the notion of here, too. Because here is always changing. It's always a contingency which is going to change. So this notion of the centrality of the network that is gravity's rainbow, it gets kind of shifted over time. And one of the really interesting ways in which this occurs, for example, is in Table 2, where we have node frequency and edge count rankings. And we can see here on the left, what's going on is the amount of time in which this character shows up as a node, which I kind of already defined. And these first 10, I would say, are the main characters of Gravity's Rainbow. Slothrop, Roger Mexico, Franz Pöckler, Václav Chicherin, Edward Pointsman, Blicero, Pirate Prentice, Gerhard von Goethe, Oberst Enzian, and Katja Borgesius. And then in the edge count here, this is something else, right? Where no longer is this character a node in the center, but serves as an edge connecting two nodes together. And note number 9 is tied between Laszlo Jamf and Lenny Pöckler. I think these are also two main characters. So I really think we have 12 main characters here. And you can see that Jamf and Pöckler, well, Pöckler goes down, But Yamp comes up because a lot of these characters serve more as crossroads than they do main nodes. And I think that's a very interesting point of analysis that Letzler brings out here. Now you can notice here in figure 2 and figure 3, the major and minor relationship network and then the major relationship network. The latter is much more refined, much more simple than the other one is. And we can really see here the centrality of Slothrop and Yamp and Chicherin and Major Marvey and, all of these different people. But one of the interesting things is the importance of the edge cases. Letzler comments, this finding resonates with another highly influential vision of connectedness that coincidentally was also published in 1973. Sociologist Mark S. Granovetter's The Strength of Weak Ties. Granovetter argues that since the strong ties in a network will tend to create weak ties between nearby nodes, weak ties essentially act as shortcuts across networks, and whatever is to be diffused can reach a larger number of people and traverse greater social distance, i.e. path length, when passed through weak ties rather than strong. Pynchon appears to have intuited this result. Only 4 of Yamp's 29 edges have more than 5 connections, and for Evan Tiers, it's 3 of 28. And this is interesting because we realize the importance of the edge cases, that the central character can often get us distracted from the importance of the edges, which increase over time as we go through Gravity's Rainbow. Other characters become gradually more important, and Slothrop decreases in importance. So Letzler says we have a handful of traditional major characters alongside a group of minor characters who are at least as effective, and sometimes more so, in connecting the various subnetworks. I would argue that the relationship between these characters enacts the tension between the contingent and eternal present that I've articulated. The former group includes most of the novel's focalizers, those through whom time in the novel is experienced, and who, consequently, tend to be those through whom the experience of a contingent present is generally articulated. The latter, though, tend to distort time and provide intimations of an eternal, inescapable temporal structure underneath, whether benevolent or malevolent. Yamp's work of destabilizing cause and effect through synthetic conditioning, Evan Tiers' work speaking to the dead, and Fongue's cinematic manipulations produce a sense that there is some larger structure through which apparently random events are controlled. And I think that most specifically, this structure is equally one of being controlled by the elites and whatnot, and also one which is defined by this communitarian sense of interconnectedness. It's mentioned at one point that paranoia is the recognition that everything is connected. And indeed, alongside that notion of connectedness and figuring out what the present means, it means realizing the importance of these edge cases. And you can see this main character network, figure 4, this is perhaps the most key way in which we can see this, in which we've got the typical Slothrop network with his associations, and on the outward part we have the whole Perkler family, and then Blissereau and Gottfried, and they kind of have their own thing. But then completely separated here when we get this micro, we have Roger Mexico, Pirate Prentice, Jeremy Beaver, Jessica Swanlake, and Edward Pointsman, and they're kind of all on their own. They're their own node, and this is the first time that we are really seeing come out a node of its own with its own kind of, this is an example of something that goes beyond the institutionalized and yet can form some sort of stable bonds. This is sort of the countercultural ideal. So I would argue that these are probably equally as important as Slothrop in terms of, think about figuring out what is Slothrop's connection between his erections and the rocket strikes. That's kind of one of the central things that gets people excited about reading the novels, trying to figure out what that is. And I would argue that Prentice and Roger Mexico and Pointsman, these are the people who are the most helpful in trying to figure out exactly what that means. Letzler comments that the most used measure of a network's reliance on its central node is something called Freeman centralization, which measures the difference between that node's degree and that of all the other nodes. Gravity's rainbow has 51% centralization, a high number, reflecting the fact that most of the characters are connected to Slothrop, and many of them only have a few edges otherwise. Yet, much criticism on the novel has claimed, as Brian McHale does, that if decentered subjectivity is the postmodern condition, then Slothrop is its poster child. The network, though, suggests the opposite, that Slothrop is a remarkably centered protagonist. As the key figure in both the narrative's focalization and its social network, Slothrop constitutes the fraught intersection of the book's conflicting temporal tensions. And this is where I have a bit of tension myself with Letzler's reading, because I think this notion of centeredness, this is purely something that's being gotten from analyzing words, where every time Slothrop is important, linguistically, he is considered central to the novel. But no. Slothrop is centered solely insofar as he shifts from being stably, psychologically centered to diffusely and porously centered as a crossroads between fractured perspectives towards the end of the novel, right? He goes from being a traditional main character to a crossroads, which emphasizes the fact that his centeredness is only a matter of perspective, which we see being decentered, as McHale says, especially as the novel progresses. A sort of analogy for the way I like to think about this is understanding the expansion of the universe, where if you look at the red shifting of stars and galaxies and everything, you can see that everything seems to be moving away from us. It looks like we are the center of the expansion of the universe. But this is just a matter of perspective. And one of the analogies that I think works really well is the raisin bread model, where if you look at a piece of raisin bread and they've got a bunch of raisins on them that are all a certain distance from each other, you can pick any raisin you want to serve as your local raisin. This would be like the equivalent of Slothrop, the place of perspective. As time goes by and the raisin bread expands, all points are separating from one another, such that it appears as if the local raisin is the center of expansion. But it's not. It's just a matter of perspective. So only at the beginning, when we're keyed into a Slothrop-centered plot or universe, do we see the book's network as reflecting a, quote, egocentric view. That's Letzler's words. But by the end, we realize that Slothrop is a mere crossroads, and only incidentally so as a matter of perspective. It's like realizing that the universe is expanding equally in all directions. All points in space are getting uniformly distant from all other points at the same time, because space itself is expanding. The space between points itself is, bred with this potential, which is expanding outwards. So I think that Letzler kind of misses the mark there, but nevertheless, I think that it's an interesting way of approaching analysis, certainly a very different way of doing literary criticism using these digital technologies. I think just because it's 2016, this independent scholar notably kind of wanted to do something different. Very interesting. Probably wouldn't read a lot of articles like this, but I hope you enjoyed and found it interesting. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because I'd really appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.